In the midst of a wedding celebration, the groomsmen decided to bring a famous gypsy to entertain the guests. But when she read the groom's palm, the ballroom was stunning, with crystal chandeliers hanging above finely decorated tables. White flowers, handpicked by Sophie, filled the air with a soft fragrance, as if nature itself was present to celebrate the union of two hearts. Golden lights reflected off champagne glasses as the guests, dressed in their finest attire, laughed and shared happy stories. The soft music in the background seemed to keep pace with the night, cradling the dreams of those who believed in eternal love. At the center of it all, Ethan and Sophie were radiant. Sophie, in her shimmering silk gown, seemed to float through the room, smiling at everyone, but always with her eyes fixed on Ethan. Their exchanged glances revealed an intense, almost tangible passion. She was the picture-perfect bride, joyful, caring, and full of hope for the future. Ethan, by her side, was charming and attentive, but there was something in his eyes that hinted at a secret, something deep he kept locked in his heart. The groomsmen, lively and always ready for a joke, moved among the guests, ensuring everyone was having fun. "We need something special, something unexpected," one of them exclaimed, raising a toast. Amidst laughter and knowing smiles, the idea arose to bring in a famous gypsy to enliven the party. "A palm reading could reveal the future," joked one of the groomsmen, winking at Ethan. Everyone laughed, but a sense of curiosity began to spread through the hall. The proposal was met with enthusiasm. The atmosphere was already vibrant with joy, but the guests craved more. Between sips of wine, conversations were filled with anticipation. "Will she read everyone's fortune?" a woman asked, adjusting her red dress, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Or will she only focus on the bride and groom?" another guest pondered as everyone laughed, excitement building like an invisible current in the air. The DJ subtly adjusted the music to something a bit more engaging, as if sensing that something big was about to happen. Ethan, though smiling at everyone, seemed slightly more tense now. Perhaps it was the excitement of the night, or maybe it was the weight of something no one else could perceive. Sophie, on the other hand, was ecstatic, her hands intertwined with Ethan's, as if the future belonged entirely to them. Their closest friends surrounded them, exchanging jokes about the upcoming gypsy, unaware that destiny had more complex plans. Waiters moved through the hall with trays of sophisticated appetizers, and glasses continued to clink in occasional toasts. It was a night that had everything to be unforgettable. The scent of roses mingled with the aroma of exquisite dishes served to the guests, while the candlelight reflected off the marble walls. Everyone felt part of a perfect love story, unaware that every detail of that night would be remembered for very different reasons. Amid laughter and greetings, the bride and groom were the center of attention, but occasionally someone noticed Ethan's pensive demeanor. He was courteous, of course, but those who knew him well noticed that from time to time, his smile faded, replaced by a distant expression. "Are you all right?" Sophie asked, gently running her hand along Ethan's arm, trying to ease any tension. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "I've never been better." The party continued in full swing. Sophie was pulled into a dance by the groomsmen, while Ethan stepped aside for a moment, watching everything from a distance. The sparkle in her eyes, the happiness in the guests, the sound of laughter, everything seemed perfect. But inside Ethan, a whirlwind of emotions fought to remain under control. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and smiled again, determined to enjoy that night. After all, it was the beginning of his new life with Sophie. As the clock ticked on and the dances became more lively, the feeling that something was about to happen began to spread among the guests, though no one knew exactly what. The side door of the hall opened silently, and a figure entered, cloaked in a dark mantle that shimmered under the soft light. It was the gypsy, her face partially covered by a thin veil, but her eyes, penetrating and intense, were an invitation to mystery. As soon as she stepped into the space, a kind of quietness enveloped the party. Conversations were interrupted, and the laughter that had previously echoed through the hall diminished to a whisper. The gypsy's energy seemed to dominate the room, and all eyes turned to her. She walked slowly, with precise steps, while the fabric of her dress brushed against the marble floor, creating a faint sound that echoed in the minds of those who watched her. The groomsmen, previously playful and carefree, were now intrigued by the presence of this woman. "Is this the famous gypsy?" one of the bridesmaids whispered, her eyes following every movement of the visitor. The guests, once so relaxed, now seemed captured by an almost childlike curiosity, wondering what she would bring to the night. Without saying a word, the gypsy smiled enigmatically and walked to a nearby table, where she sat with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. The soft music was lowered even more, as if the DJ had also been touched by the mystery of her presence. Her long fingers began to trace patterns in the air, as if feeling the energies around. Ethan and Sophie, watching from afar, exchanged glances. Sophie smiled, amused by the atmosphere she was creating, while Ethan remained serious, his eyes fixed on the gypsy's fluid movements. The first guests approached her with a playful air, clearly enchanted by the novelty. A man with a broad smile extended his hand. "Let's see what the future holds for me," he said, laughing as the gypsy gently held his palm. She observed him for a moment, her eyes fixed on the lines of his hand, and then began to speak in a low and engaging tone. Every word, even the simplest ones, seemed laden with meaning, and soon laughter filled the hall again. Little by little, other guests approached with the same curiosity. The gypsy, with an almost hypnotic calm, read one hand after another, describing small details about their futures. "You'll encounter a big surprise soon," she told a young woman in a blue dress who walked away smiling. With each reading, the guests became more at ease, and laughter once again filled the air, breaking the initial tension her presence had brought. Gradually, the groomsmen began to tease the bride and groom. "And you too? Aren't you going to take a chance?" one of Ethan's friends asked, winking at him. Sophie laughed, tossing her hair back. "I think it would be fun," she replied, nudging Ethan in the arm. He smiled, but his eyes betrayed a slight concern. Perhaps it was just the weight of the night or maybe something deeper, but at that moment he avoided the gypsy's gaze. She continued her readings, always calm, always captivating. Even the skeptics, who had initially laughed at the idea of a gypsy at the party, were now around her, fascinated. Every gesture of hers was calculated, every word, an invitation to dream. The predictions were light, promises of future joys and small adventures, which made everyone relax once more. It seemed that the party, which had momentarily become tense, was returning to its cheerful and carefree rhythm. Sophie, enlivened by the relaxed atmosphere, began to approach the gypsy, pulling Ethan by the hand. "Come on, darling. Just for fun," she said, laughing. Ethan hesitated, his smile slightly forced. But with all eyes on them, there was no way to refuse. He let out a soft sigh and followed Sophie to the table where the gypsy awaited them, her gaze never leaving Ethan's face. She knew and he felt it. The gypsy raised her eyes slowly when Ethan and Sophie approached. Her smile was polite, but there was an intensity in her gaze that made Ethan pause for a brief moment before sitting down. The hall was silent again, the anticipation growing. What would she say now? The gypsy, with her mysterious eyes and soft voice, continued to entertain the guests, who laughed and marveled at the surprisingly accurate readings. One of the groomsmen, a robust man with a light-hearted spirit, approached her with a playful expression of challenge. "Come on, what does fate have in store for me?" he said, extending his hand. She looked at him deeply, her lips forming a slight smile before she began to speak. "You will find something unexpected. At home. Something that has been there all along but that you never noticed." His friends burst into laughter, already imagining jokes about that prediction. Amidst the laughter, the gypsy moved from guest to guest, her words sometimes causing laughter, sometimes sparking curious glances. A woman in a red dress leaned over the table, eager for her turn. "I just want to know if I'll finally find love," she joked, her eyes sparkling with expectation. The gypsy held her hand and observed it for a moment before saying, "Love is already around you. You just haven't recognized it yet." A murmur of excitement swept through the guests as the woman blinked several times, trying to hide the blush rising to her cheeks. Sophie, beside Ethan, watched everything with an enchanted smile. "She's good, isn't she?" she murmured to Ethan, who nodded, though without the same enthusiasm. "Yes, intriguing," he replied, casting a quick glance at the gypsy, as if something about her presence made him uncomfortable. Sophie didn't notice the tension in his tone, distracted by the flow of guests approaching the table for more readings. The groomsmen, now in a circle, continued to tease and laugh among themselves, and Sophie joined in the conversation, joking about what secrets the gypsy might uncover. The party gradually regained its rhythm. The background music was lively again, and some couples had already returned to dancing. But around the gypsy's table, the atmosphere was different. There, a mixture of curiosity and expectation hung in the air. Between readings, the guests exchanged glances and smiles, as if the gypsy was not just reading palms but also connecting destinies in a way no one could predict. "It's amazing how she knows these things," a guest commented, holding her boyfriend's arm tightly. "She told me a big change is going to happen at work. How did she know?" Meanwhile, Sophie continued laughing with her friends, exchanging jokes and reminiscing about college days. The groomsmen, known for their constant pranks, were now entertained by the idea of asking the gypsy for a more daring reading. "What if she predicts how many kids you'll have?" one of them teased, nudging both Sophie and Ethan. Sophie laughed. "Well, I hope not too many," she said, winking at Ethan, who smiled back, though his gaze seemed distant. The circle around the gypsy's table grew as more guests approached, eager for a dose of mystical entertainment. An older man, impeccably dressed, approached with evident skepticism. "I'll challenge you, Gypsy. I want to know something about myself that no one else knows," he said, crossing his arms. The gypsy did not hesitate. "You keep a letter in a locked drawer for more than 10 years. It's time to read it again." The man's face turned pale, and he walked away slowly, under the curious glances of those around him. The laughter returned to echo, but the atmosphere was beginning to change. Sophie, now more curious, leaned towards the gypsy. "So, what else do you see around? Any big revelations for someone at this party?" The gypsy smiled but did not answer immediately. Her gaze scanned the room as if looking for something or someone. Ethan, watching from a distance, seemed increasingly restless. He shifted in his chair, his smile fading with each passing minute. Sophie noticed his distraction and squeezed his hand, giving him a calm look. "Is everything okay, love?" she asked tenderly. Ethan forced a smile and nodded, but something in his expression indicated he was not entirely at ease. Perhaps it was the gypsy's aura, or perhaps something deeper that even he couldn't explain. But the groomsmen, always attentive, would not let the opportunity pass. "Ethan, are you avoiding the gypsy?" one of them said, provoking laughter around. "Maybe you have a very bright future to be revealed," another joked. Sophie laughed, shaking her head. "He's shy when it comes to predictions," she said, unaware of the real weight her words might carry. Between one joke and another, laughter once again filled the hall. The guests, cheered by the light-hearted predictions and the festive atmosphere, seemed completely at ease, while the gypsy continued her little performance. Yet there was something, a subtle tension that only Ethan seemed to feel. The moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. Reluctantly, Ethan sat across from the gypsy, who looked at him with an enigmatic smile, as if she knew more than she let on. The hall, which had been filled with laughter and animated conversations, now seemed suspended in expectation. The gypsy reached out to Ethan, her long, delicate fingers hovering over the table for a brief moment before holding his hand. Her touch was soft but firm, as if connecting to something far deeper than the surface of the skin. Sophie, beside him, was still smiling, unaware of the growing tension in the air. "Come on, love, what will she find?" she joked, lightly squeezing Ethan's arm, her eyes shining with curiosity. She looked at the gypsy and said with a light-hearted tone, "I hope you bring good news." The gypsy, however, did not respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the lines of Ethan's hand, and for a moment she seemed to be in a world of her own, far from the surrounding voices. The music in the hall began to fade gradually, as if the very environment was tuning in to the gravity of the moment. Ethan, who had maintained a controlled smile until then, began to feel the weight of the gypsy's gaze upon him. It was as if every second beside her revealed a part of him he preferred to keep hidden. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure, but there was something in the intensity of that silence that unsettled him. Sophie, not noticing the change, was still chuckling softly, amused by the situation. Around them, the guests looked on with curiosity, some whispering to each other, while others simply watched in silence. There was a mix of amusement and anticipation in the air, as if everyone expected yet another of the gypsy's light-hearted and playful predictions from earlier in the evening. But somehow the atmosphere around Ethan felt different. The smiles on the people's faces didn't seem as relaxed anymore, and the gypsy, previously so fluid and cheerful, was now serious, completely focused. Ethan felt a slight tremor run through his hand, but it wasn't from the gypsy, it was his own. A subtle anxiety began to spread through his body, like a shadow he couldn't shake. He didn't believe in predictions, and yet something in that moment left him uneasy. Perhaps it was the intensity with which everyone was watching him, or perhaps it was the fact that, despite his efforts, he knew there was something in his past he preferred to keep buried. Something that, at that moment, seemed closer to the surface than ever. The gypsy finally spoke, her voice low and captivating like the whisper of a secret. "You carry more than you show, Ethan," she said, without taking her eyes off the palm of his hand. Ethan felt a shiver down his spine. Sophie, not understanding the tone of those words, let out a nervous laugh. "We all have secrets, right?" she said, trying to ease the tension forming around them. But Ethan didn't laugh. He just looked at the gypsy, waiting for what would come next. The gypsy slowly raised her eyes, meeting Ethan's. The smile that had previously been on her face now seemed distant, almost non-existent. There was something in her eyes, an intensity that made Ethan's heart race. He could feel the hall around them fading, as if, at that moment, only the two of them existed. "The future always finds its way," she said, in a tone that made the silence in the hall deepen further. Sophie, sensing that something was wrong, frowned. "Hey, what's happening?" "It's just a palm reading, right?" she asked, looking from Ethan to the gypsy, not understanding the sudden heavy atmosphere that had settled between them. The groomsmen, who had been laughing moments before, now also watched in silence, the laughter frozen on their lips. The air around the table seemed to have changed, as if an invisible cloud had descended upon them. Ethan tried to pull his hand back, but the gypsy held it firmly, her fingers cold as ice. "Sometimes the past returns when we least expect it," she said, her words cutting through the hall's silence like sharp knives. And it was at that moment that Ethan realized what was about to be revealed was not just a game, not just a simple party prank. There was something more, something he had always feared facing. The gypsy's smile, which until then had brought an enigmatic lightness, began to fade from her face, like mist slowly dissipating. Her gaze intensified, fixed on the lines of Ethan's hand. She hesitated, her fingers still in contact with his palm, as if she were trying to decipher something deeper, something that simple words could not immediately convey. The hall, which had been filled with whispers and laughter, now fell into an almost uncomfortable silence. All eyes were on her and the groom, waiting for what would come next. Sophie, beside him, felt the atmosphere shift subtly but powerfully. The sparkle in her eyes began to fade, and her expression, once amused, became confused. She looked at Ethan, hoping to see a reassuring calm in him, but his face was rigid, his lips pressed into a thin line. The gypsy's cold touch seemed to have left him tense, and Sophie noticed something was amiss. The air around them seemed to have changed, becoming heavier, as if an invisible cloud hovered over the table. The gypsy remained silent for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. She looked at the lines on Ethan's hand as if trying to see beyond the physical, something hidden in the depths of his soul. The groomsmen, who moments before had been joking and sharing amused glances, were now also silent, their smiles fading as the atmosphere in the hall grew heavier. The guests began to shift uneasily in their seats, picking up on the growing tension without fully understanding what was happening. Ethan, for his part, began to feel a knot forming in his stomach. Each passing second without the gypsy speaking felt like an invisible blow to his composure. He tried to pull his hand back, but the gypsy held it firmly, her eyes never leaving the lines she was reading so intently. His breathing became shorter, and his heart raced uncontrollably. There was something about that silence that scared him more than any words that could be spoken. The hall, once festive and welcoming, now felt oppressive. The lights that sparkled on the white flowers and decorated tables no longer had the same effect, and the sound of music, which had softened, now seemed completely absent. The environment was still, as if time had slowed down. Every guest, every glance, was fixed on the gypsy and what she was about to say. The suspense was palpable, and the party that had been marked by laughter and lightness was now on the brink of something unknown. Sophie finally broke the silence, her voice low and hesitant. "Is everything all right?" she asked, addressing both the gypsy and Ethan, as if searching for an explanation for the sudden shift in atmosphere. But the gypsy did not respond immediately. She released Ethan's hand with a gentle touch, as if she knew what was coming next would require strength from everyone present. Her dark eyes, once serene, were now filled with something bordering on sorrow. The air around them seemed to chill, as though an invisible breeze had passed through the hall, taking the last hint of joy with it. The guests exchanged glances, confused and apprehensive. "Why did she stop?" someone whispered, but no one answered. There was a strange sense of anticipation in the air, a feeling that something much larger was about to unfold. The previous laughter and jokes now seemed distant, as if they belonged to another night, another party. Ethan finally spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "What are you seeing?" The question was simple, yet laden with palpable anxiety. The hall, now wrapped in an almost suffocating quiet, awaited the answer. Sophie looked at her fiancé, trying to read something in his expression, but all she saw was a tension she had never noticed before. The gypsy slowly lifted her head, her eyes meeting Ethan's with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his soul. She let out a slight sigh before finally breaking the silence. The look on her face was that of someone bearing a burden too heavy for the light words she had spoken earlier. The atmosphere, now irrevocably altered, left everyone on the edge of their seats, waiting anxiously for what was to come. In that moment, the future everyone had been eager to hear about began to take shape, but in a way no one there could have foreseen. The gypsy took a deep breath, as if the words she was about to say weighed heavily on her tongue. Her gaze, carrying a strange mix of compassion and gravity, rested on Ethan, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low but clear enough to cut through the silence reigning in the hall. "Your lifeline is short," she said, her delicate fingers tracing the lines on his hand. "It's interrupted abruptly. There's a dark secret you carry. Something that can no longer be ignored." Her voice sounded like the echo of an inevitable destiny. The words lingered in the air, like a shadow slowly spreading through the hall. The impact was immediate. The murmur among the guests ceased completely. A deadly silence took over the room, as if even the air had been sucked out. The looks, once full of curiosity, were now of shock. Sophie, standing next to Ethan, felt her heart tighten in her chest. She turned to her fiancé, her expression confused, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and fear. "What does that mean, Ethan?" she murmured, her voice trembling. Ethan, who had been composed until then, began to sweat lightly. His hands, which had been steady, now trembled slightly as he tried to stay calm. The gypsy continued to stare at him as if expecting a response, but he simply averted his gaze, unable to meet Sophie's eyes or those of the gypsy. His heart was now pounding harder, almost painfully against his chest, and he could feel all the eyes fixed on him. The weight of his secret, buried for so long, now seemed to press down on him from all sides. The guests, who had been cheerful and carefree earlier, were now in a state of tense expectation. No one dared to say anything, but everyone could feel that something profoundly wrong was happening. A woman at the end of a table exchanged worried glances with her husband, and some of the groomsmen, who had been joking and laughing, were now motionless, as if they were waiting for a tragedy to unfold. The celebratory mood that had filled the hall was completely gone, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Sophie, feeling as if something was slipping beyond her control, held Ethan's hand as if physical contact could bring her back to the safety of moments before. "Ethan," she said, her voice firmer now, her eyes locked onto his face. "What's happening?" Her tone held a hint of desperation, but also an urgent need for answers. She didn't know exactly what the gypsy meant, but Ethan's expression, the way he avoided her eyes, confirmed that there was something there. Something terrible. Ethan, however, remained silent for what felt like an eternity. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to deflect the suffocating attention. But he knew there was no escape. The secret he carried, the one he had buried so deeply, was on the verge of emerging. And the worst part was that now, in front of everyone, Sophie, his friends, his family, he didn't know how to control the impact that was about to come. He swallowed hard, but his throat was dry. It felt as if the very air had become too heavy to breathe. The hall, which had once seemed large and spacious, now felt small, cramped, almost claustrophobic. Everyone was trapped in that moment of suspense, waiting for a revelation they weren't sure they wanted to hear. Even the fortune-teller, who had remained poised and enigmatic, seemed to bear the tension of the moment on her shoulders. Her gaze was still fixed on Ethan, but her eyes now held a shadow of regret, as if she knew that what had started as a joke was turning into something much bigger. Sophie finally let go of Ethan's hand and stepped back slightly, as if she needed space to process what was happening. "A secret?" she repeated, the word coming out of her mouth like a veiled accusation. "Ethan, what secret is this?" The silence that followed her question was deafening. Everyone waited. The air was so dense it felt as if no one dared to breathe. Ethan, now with his eyes downcast, knew he could no longer avoid the confrontation. Eventually he looked up, briefly meeting Sophie's eyes, and in that instant she knew that what she was about to hear would change everything. Whatever it was, the weight of the truth was about to be revealed, and no one in that hall was prepared for the impact that would follow. Sophie could no longer contain the anguish growing within her. Her face, once lit by the smile of a bride in love, was now marked by confusion and fear. She took a step forward, her voice trembling but firm. "Ethan, what did she mean by that? Ethan, what's going on?" Sophie's voice broke the silence of the hall like a hammer. All eyes turned to them, and the tension that had hovered discreetly now filled the air, suffocating what remained of the lightness of the party. Sophie's eyes desperately sought an explanation, a word that could dispel the dark foreboding. Visibly shaken, Ethan took a step back, trying to compose himself. "It's nothing, Sophie, it's just a game, a joke," he replied with a nervous smile that convinced no one. His voice sounded calm, but the sweat on his forehead and the tremor in his hands betrayed the opposite. He tried to let out a laugh, but it quickly died in his throat. "The fortune teller is just doing what she's expected to do. "There's nothing real about it," he insisted, but his words sounded hollow, as if even he didn't believe them. Sophie did not move. Her gaze fixed on him, her breathing heavier, showed that she wasn't willing to accept vague explanations. "No, Ethan," she said more firmly now. "This isn't just a joke. You're hiding something. I can feel it." Her voice, once gentle, now carried a weight that made a murmur begin to grow among the guests around them. The people, who had been merely curious onlookers, were now attentive, as if they sensed they were on the verge of a monumental revelation. With each passing second, the distance between Ethan and Sophie seemed to increase, not physically but emotionally. He avoided her eyes, which only reinforced the idea that something was terribly wrong. "Sophie, please don't do this here," he pleaded in a low, almost begging tone, not realizing that the simple act of asking for silence in front of everyone was already compromising him. His desire to maintain calm now sounded more like desperation to hide something that couldn't be revealed there, in that moment, before so many eyes. "Why not here, Ethan?" Sophie's voice rose slightly, causing even more guests to turn their attention to them. She took another step toward him, demanding an answer he was not ready to give. "If not now, when?" Her words hung in the air, as sharp as the tension that grew with each second. The hall seemed to have closed in a circle around them, and what had once been a party now seemed more like an arena for an emotional showdown. The groomsmen, who had been so cheerful, now looked at each other uneasily. One tried to make a move to intervene, but stopped, realizing that the storm brewing between the bride and groom was not something that could be interrupted. The silence that followed was even more suffocating than Ethan's unspoken words. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Sophie, impatient and with tear-filled eyes, waited. "Ethan, please," she said, and this time there was more than anger or frustration in her voice. There was a deep pain, the beginning of a betrayal she could not yet name. "I need you to be honest with me." But all he did was avert his gaze again, fixing it on the floor as if he could find there a way out of the truth that was suffocating him. The walls of the hall, the laughter from before, everything disappeared. Only the two of them and the tension that pulsed between each beat of their hearts remained. The fortune-teller, seated nearby, watched everything with a serenity that seemed unsettling, as if she already knew the outcome of this scene. She said nothing more, her words had already planted the seed of confrontation. Now it was up to Ethan to decide what to do with it. Sophie, realizing she could no longer contain the avalanche of emotions, made one last attempt. "If there's something you're hiding, it's now that I need to know." The party, the celebration, the love, everything seemed distant now. What remained was a sharp silence, a confrontation between two people who loved each other but were, at that moment, more distant than ever. Ethan, still silent, finally lifted his eyes to Sophie, and what she saw in his gaze confirmed her darkest suspicions. The man she thought she knew, the man with whom she was about to share a life, had secrets she could no longer ignore. Ethan ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that didn't go unnoticed. His eyes now roamed the hall, avoiding Sophie's and everyone else's gaze, as if seeking an invisible escape. His breathing was heavy, erratic, and his words, when they finally came out, were hesitant, fragmented. It's nothing, Sophie. Not now," he said with a fragile voice, very different from the confident man he had been at the beginning of that night. His discomfort made no sense to those unaware of what was to come, but it was evident that something inside him was breaking. The groomsmen, who had been mere observers, now exchanged glances among themselves, whispering softly, unable to grasp what was happening but sensing that something very serious was at stake. One of them, closer to Ethan since childhood, took a step forward but stopped, unsure of how to intervene. "Ethan, man, what's going on?" He tried to use a casual tone, as if wishing to dissipate the tension, but there was a shadow of worry in his voice. The others began to discreetly approach, as if the simple act of being near might force Ethan to speak. Sophie looked from one to the other, trying to grasp what was hidden behind the glances and whispers. The doubt began to settle in her heart like a stone sinking slowly into calm waters. The woman who, minutes ago, believed she was living the happiest night of her life, now found herself surrounded by an atmosphere of mystery and mistrust. "What is it, Ethan?" she repeated, her voice now lower, almost a whisper, but filled with growing fear. With each second he remained silent, the distance between them grew. The guests, still confused, began to realize that something more serious was happening. The lightness of the party dissolved into a growing unease. A murmur began to spread through the hall as more people noticed the tension between the bride and groom. "He's hiding something," a woman whispered to her husband, who just nodded, his gaze fixed on Ethan. The air, once festive, now felt thick, heavy, as if a storm was about to form at the center of the hall. Ethan, surrounded by glances from all sides, seemed trapped in a snare. His eyes darted from one corner to another, desperately searching for an escape that didn't exist. His fingers tapped on the side of his leg, an involuntary gesture that betrayed his anxiety. Every second of silence only confirmed what everyone there was beginning to suspect. He was hiding something. Something big. And now there was no more avoiding it. The groomsmen, who had been laughing and joking, were now serious, their expressions grim. Some whispered among themselves, trying to understand what could be happening. "This doesn't look good," said one of them, worried. The bridesmaids exchanged glances with Sophie, trying to offer silent support, but none of them knew exactly what to do. The atmosphere of celebration had evaporated, replaced by a suffocating uncertainty. Doubt no longer lingered only in Sophie's heart. Now it hovered over everyone in the hall. Sophie, who until then had tried to remain calm, felt her chest tighten. This was the man she loved, with whom she had imagined building a whole life, and now he stood there before her like a stranger. "Please, Ethan," she said, her voice choked by the fear of what was to come. "If there's something you need to tell me, do it now." Her eyes were brimming with tears, and her body trembled slightly, as if she was on the brink of a devastating revelation she wasn't prepared to hear. Ethan took another step back, as if trying to escape the crushing pressure around him, but he was surrounded not just by people but by the weight of what was to come. He briefly looked at his friends, the groomsmen, and finally turned his eyes back to Sophie. For a second it seemed like he was going to relent, but instead he shook his head. "Not now. Not here," he murmured, almost inaudibly, but enough for everyone around to perceive the gravity of his refusal. Doubt was now a visible shadow over him, over Sophie, over everyone. The murmurs intensified, the climate of suspicion spreading like poison. Ethan tried to maintain control, but it was clear to everyone that he was hiding something. And the more he dodged, the closer that dark truth seemed to coming to light. Sophie, with her heart racing, knew she was on the verge of a truth that could change everything. The fortune teller, who until then had remained silent, rose slowly from her seat. Her gaze, filled with compassion, fell on Ethan. There was something in her eyes that transcended the mere act of palm reading, something deeper and ancestral. She took a deep breath, knowing that the truth she was about to reveal would be the breaking point. "I know this burden, Ethan," she said, her voice low but firm. "The lines on your hand, they carry more than just your destiny. They reveal something that ties you to a life that has already passed. The family of the victim is connected to me, and I can feel the pain you carry and what you hide from everyone here." A gasp of shock rippled through the hall, as if the gravity of the fortune teller's words had fallen on everyone at once. Sophie looked at the woman, disbelief written across her face. Victim? Spiritual connection? She tried to process what she was hearing, but the pain began to pierce her before she could fully understand. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if the world was spinning too fast for her to hold on. How could there be such a terrible secret? And how had she, who loved him so much, never known? The guests, frozen, barely dared to breathe. It was as if time had frozen, each of them trapped between disbelief and horror. The fortune teller's words hung in the air, laden with meaning, turning what had once seemed like a simple palm reading into an act of deep revelation. Ethan, his gaze fixed on the floor, did not deny it. He couldn't deny it. The weight of everything he had hidden seemed now to suffocate him. The secret he had kept for so many years was on the verge of being completely exposed, and there was no longer any escape. Sophie, her voice breaking, took a step forward, facing Ethan with tear-filled eyes. "Ethan?" Her voice was fragile, shattered. "What is this? Who are you?" The question was not just about the past but about their entire relationship. How could she have lived beside him without realizing he carried such a dark burden? Her heart, once filled with love and expectations for the future, was now consumed by confusion and a crushing pain. It was as if the Ethan she thought she knew was an illusion. Ethan remained silent, his shoulders slumped, defeated. He knew he could no longer hide the truth, but the pain of seeing Sophie, the woman he loved, consumed by shock, paralyzed him. Each passing second was a blow, and the truth was on the verge of emerging, whether through him or the fortune teller. Sophie, trembling, turned to the fortune teller as if seeking better understanding. You knew this person? What are you saying?" The fortune teller, now standing beside Sophie, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Years ago, someone's life was taken abruptly and tragically. Ethan's fate became entwined with that person's in that moment, and since then, he has carried this weight. I know the pain of that family. I know the spirit that has yet to find peace. And when I touched Ethan's hand, I felt that connection. I felt the echo of this dark past. The silence in the hall deepened, almost becoming oppressive. Some guests looked at Ethan with horror, while others exchanged suspicious glances. The revelation was far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The party, once a symbol of love and hope, was now tainted by secrets that no one knew how to handle. Sophie, still trying to absorb everything, clasped her hands over her heart as if trying to hold on to her broken heart. She staggered slightly as if the fortune-teller's words had struck her physically. "Ethan, how could you hide this from me?" Her voice was no longer filled with anger but with profound sadness. Her image of the man she was about to marry was crumbling before her eyes. He who had always seemed so controlled, so strong, now stood on the brink of collapse, unable to face the weight of the truth he had been hiding for so long. The murmurs among the guests grew louder. Some moved away, while others drew closer to try to understand the situation better. Ethan, witnessing the chaos his lies had caused, felt panic rise within him. But he knew it was too late to avoid the truth. The fortune-teller, with one last look of compassion, turned to him. "The choice is yours, Ethan. The truth is almost completely exposed. Only you can decide how this ends." Ethan, feeling the unbearable weight of the revelation and the oppressive silence spreading throughout the hall, could no longer hold back. With his face twisted by guilt, he dropped to his knees before Sophie, tears finally streaming down his face. I'm so sorry, Sophie. Forgive me." His voice broke mid-sentence, suffocated by the pain he had been suppressing for years. Shame, regret, and despair mingled with every word that left his mouth. He looked around, seeing the shocked and incredulous faces of the guests. "I know I lied, I hid this from all of you, but I never wanted it to come to this." Sophie stood still, looking at him with tear-filled eyes but unable to speak. The man she loved, with whom she had imagined a future full of dreams and happiness, was now kneeling before her, begging for forgiveness. But the revelation was too overwhelming to process. She loved him, of course, but how could she continue beside someone who had kept such a devastating secret? Sophie's mind spun, her heart beating erratically as she struggled to find an answer within herself. Ethan, still on his knees, held her hands tightly as if that simple contact could save what was left between them. "I don't know how to move forward without you, Sophie. Please, give me a chance to make this right, to show I'm better than the man who hid this truth." His words were desperate, each sentence loaded with genuine remorse. He longed for redemption, a second chance, but he knew that what he was asking for was not simple. Sophie's silence was more painful than any words she could have spoken. The guests, once silent figures in the backdrop of the party, were now visibly divided. Some looked at Ethan with compassion, as if they understood the weight of his guilt, while others stared at him with judgment and disgust. The air was heavy with tension, and it seemed the entire hall awaited with bated breath for Sophie's next move. She looked at Ethan's hands holding hers, her tears now soaking the veil she still wore, and her heart broke a little more. She loved this man, but would love be enough? Sophie's mind was in turmoil. Anger, pain, and disappointment fought against the deep love she felt for Ethan. "How can I forgive you for this?" she finally whispered, her voice filled with an endless sadness. "I gave you everything, and you kept such an important part of your life from me. How can I ever trust you again?" Her words pierced Ethan, but he knew they were true. He knew he had broken something fundamental between them. Ethan lowered his head, sobbing quietly. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't know how to fix this, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying if you let me. I'll surrender, I'll face whatever's necessary, but I can't lose you. Please, Sophie." The sound of his voice pleading in despair caused some guests to look away, unable to bear the intensity of the scene before them. Sophie sighed deeply, as if the internal struggle within her was intensifying with every second. She loved Ethan. She always had. But the weight of this revelation was crushing everything she thought she knew about him. Her mind searched for a way out, an answer, but everything seemed hazy, confusing. The hall, once a stage for celebration, now seemed the setting of a painful drama, with each guest holding their breath, awaiting the verdict. Kneeling before her, Ethan was a broken figure, a shadow of the man he had been that same night, while Sophie, battling with her emotions, was forced to make an impossible decision. She pulled her hands away, leaving Ethan there, kneeling alone, his eyes still full of tears. I don't know, Ethan," she said, her voice barely escaping her throat. "I don't know if I can forgive you." The hall fell into a deafening silence. Sophie's decision, hanging in the air like an unspoken sentence, left everyone in suspense. And there, between ruined love and the search for redemption, everything seemed frozen in time, as if the future were at the edge of a precipice, waiting to fall. The silence weighed like a mountain on everyone in the hall. Ethan, kneeling with tears streaming down his face, seemed at a loss for what to say. His eyes were fixed on Sophie, pleading for a response, for a sign that she could still believe in him. But Sophie stood there, immobile, struggling with the conflicting emotions swirling inside her. That was when the fortune teller, who had witnessed everything in silence, stepped forward, her piercing eyes fixed on Sophie. "Not all is lost," the fortune teller said, her voice calm but filled with a spiritual authority that caused the room to tremble slightly. "Ethan's fate, though stained by the past, can still be altered." Sophie's eyes turned to the fortune teller, as if the very idea of redemption were difficult to believe at that moment. "He has a chance at redemption," the fortune teller continued, her voice flowing like a promise. "But only if he faces what he's done, confronts his guilt and truly seeks justice." The fortune teller's words seemed to offer a path through the chaos, a light amid the darkness. Sophie was deeply shaken, but the possibility that Ethan could redeem himself, that he might have a chance to change, began to take root in her mind. She looked at Ethan, still on his knees, his face a mixture of remorse and despair, and something within her hesitated. Could she really grant him this last chance? The hall was in suspense, as if everyone there was caught in the same indecision consuming Sophie. The guests' eyes shifted between Sophie and the fortune teller, trying to comprehend the gravity of the moment. "If he faces the truth and seeks the justice he has so far denied," the fortune teller said softly, "there's a hope that his future won't be what I saw in the lines of his hand. But he must rise and confront what he has avoided for so long." Sophie felt another wave of emotion surge within her. She was torn between the love she had for Ethan and the overwhelming betrayal that now separated them. The idea of redemption was beautiful but painful. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She gazed deeply into Ethan's eyes, trying to see the man she loved beneath the weight of everything. "You have one chance, Ethan," she whispered to herself, not realizing she had spoken aloud. Ethan, hearing the faint tremble in Sophie's words, clung to that sliver of hope as if it were his only salvation. "I'll do anything, Sophie," he pleaded, his voice choked with tears. "I'll face what I've done. I'll do whatever it takes to redeem myself, but I need you by my side. I can't do this alone." The desperation in his voice was palpable, and he looked at her with the fragile hope of a man at the edge of an abyss. But Sophie was still hesitant. Every fiber of her being was torn between the desire to believe in him and the fear of being betrayed again. She had dreamed of a future with Ethan, but now it was all marred by secrets, lies, and a truth she could never have imagined. Her heart was shattered, but the possibility that he could change, that he could truly face his demons, was a thought she couldn't completely dismiss. The fortune teller, sensing Sophie's internal conflict, looked at her with a mixture of compassion and wisdom. "The path to redemption is long and painful," she said calmly. "But it's a path he must walk if he wants to deserve the forgiveness you still have the power to give." The words struck deeply into Sophie's heart, leaving her even more torn. She looked at Ethan, still kneeling, waiting for a sign that he could be the man she believed he could be. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to make. Every second seemed to stretch infinitely as all eyes in the hall were on her, waiting, judging, but above all, hoping she would choose the right path. Sophie looked deeply into Ethan's eyes, her heart divided between love and pain. The silence in the hall was absolute, as if time had stopped, awaiting her decision. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words even before she spoke them. "I can forgive you, Ethan," she began, her voice low but filled with unexpected firmness. "But only if you face what you've done. You need to confess, you need to go to the police and pay for your actions. Only then can I believe you truly want to change." Ethan, still kneeling, felt a knot tighten in his throat. Sophie's words hit him like a harsh blow, but he knew she was right. If he wanted to reclaim his dignity, if he wanted any hope of true forgiveness, he would have to face his past with courage. "I will do it, Sophie," he whispered, his gaze fixed on hers, tears still streaming down his face. "I promise. I'll turn myself in. I'll face everything. I would do anything to deserve a second chance with you." The hall, still shrouded in silence, seemed to hold its breath, watching the charged moment between the two. Sophie hesitated for an instant, her heart still wavering between the betrayal she felt and the remnants of love she still held. "You need to understand, Ethan," she said, her voice now more controlled. "This isn't just about me. You took a life, you hid this for so long, and nothing will erase what happened. But maybe by facing it, you can find redemption." Ethan nodded slowly, each word from her hitting him like an undeniable truth. He knew there was no going back, no undoing what he had done, but now he had the chance to do the right thing. "I'll turn myself in," he repeated, stronger this time, as if convincing himself too. I'll pay for what I've done, even if it means losing you forever. There was still despair in his voice, but now there was also determination, an acceptance of the path he needed to walk. Sophie felt tears well up in her eyes again. She loved him, but the damage caused by his secret was too great to simply ignore. I don't know if we can go back to what we were, Ethan, she admitted, her voice breaking mid-sentence. But I don't want you to carry this forever. If you're honest now, if you face the consequences, maybe there's a path for you, even if it's not by my side. Ethan bowed his head, feeling the weight of her words. He wanted to believe that by confronting his past, he could somehow regain what he had lost. But he knew Sophie was no longer the same, and he too would never be the same after all this. I will do it, he said, his voice firm now. I'll turn myself in and accept whatever comes. I won't run from what I've done anymore. Sophie watched him for a few seconds, and for the first time since the revelation, she saw something in Ethan's eyes that she hadn't seen before. A deep sincerity, a genuine acceptance of what he had done. Her heart still ached, but something in that moment made her believe that perhaps he truly could change. Then go, Ethan, she said, with a tone of farewell in her voice. Do what needs to be done. The hall remained silent as Ethan slowly stood up, his eyes red and his body still trembling. He looked at Sophie one last time, hoping that, somehow, this moment could be a new beginning, even though the future was uncertain. Thank you, he murmured, the words fragile but filled with gratitude. He knew this was his last chance at redemption, and he was ready to face whatever came his way. With that, Ethan's fate began to draw a different path as the hall watched, still enveloped in a solemn silence. The next day, Ethan surrendered to the police, accompanied only by the silence of his own decision. He had finally accepted responsibility for the mistakes he had hidden for so long. When he walked through the doors of the station, his heart was heavy, but for the first time in years he felt he was walking towards the truth. The image of Sophie from the previous night continued to echo in his mind, a mix of pain and hope that pushed him to keep moving forward, even knowing that the path to redemption would be long and lonely. The trial was swift, but the impact of his actions was profound. Ethan confessed everything. The accident, the escape, the guilt he had carried in secret. There was no defense, only acceptance of the consequences. When the sentence was read and he was taken to prison, he knew this was the first step in trying to regain what little dignity remained. Sophie, still shaken, did not attend the trial. She would need time, perhaps more than him, to process everything that had happened. The first months in prison were harsh. Ethan faced not only the physical consequences of his new reality but also the ghosts of his past. He spent hours in silence, reflecting on his life, trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. But slowly, something within him began to change. He volunteered for prison jobs, participated in support groups to deal with guilt, and, for the first time, began to feel the weight of responsibility and the need to become a better person. Years passed, and news of his release came quietly. Ethan had served his sentence, and though the scars of his past were deep, he emerged from prison a different man, more mature, more aware. The road to redemption was long, but he knew the worst was behind him. Now, the true challenge was to rebuild his life, away from the lies and guilt that had imprisoned him for so long. During this time, Sophie also moved on. Although the love for Ethan still existed in some form, the marriage was never resumed. She chose to focus on her own healing, finding strength in her friendships and the family that supported her. Years later, she had rebuilt her life, but occasionally she would catch herself thinking about the man she had once loved deeply. Not with anger, but with a sense of acceptance. They were different people now, marked by the choices and mistakes of the past. One morning, Ethan decided to visit the grave of the man whose life he had taken years before. He knelt in front of the tombstone, his hands trembling as they touched the cold stone. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice low and hoarse. I can never undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor your memory. He stayed there, in silence, feeling the weight of the past finally begin to lift. The pain remained, but there was also a new peace, an understanding that this moment marked the end of a cycle that had defined him for so long. A few days later, he sought out Sophie. The house where she lived now was cozy and colorful, with vibrant flowers in the garden, a testament to her strength and capacity for rebirth. When Sophie opened the door and found Ethan standing before her, there was a heavy silence. She looked him in the eyes, and for a moment the words were stuck. However, the years had given her wisdom, and she finally broke the silence. Did you come seeking forgiveness, Ethan? Ethan took a deep breath, and his gaze met hers with sincerity. Yes, Sophie. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you in a way that I can never undo. But I want you to know that all these years, The only thing that kept me alive was the hope of being able to fix something, of being able to show you that I am a different man now." His voice was shaky, but filled with an honesty that had been lost for a long time. She invited him in, and they sat at the kitchen table, where they had often shared laughter and dreams in the past. The evening light entered through the window, illuminating Sophie's face with a softness that Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. They talked at length, reminiscing about the past, but also exploring the new people they had become. Sophie listened with a serious but open look. Gradually, she began to see that the man in front of her was no longer the same. "You know, Ethan," she began after a long silence, "as much as I suffered, I also learned to forgive myself during this time. Maybe I can forgive you too." Ethan felt a wave of relief and emotion and held her hand gently, as if he were holding something fragile and precious. "I don't expect a fairy tale ending. I just want a chance to, perhaps, rebuild something new, even if it's just a friendship," he said. The following weeks were full of conversations and discreet meetings, where the two learned to rediscover each other. Sophie set boundaries, and Ethan respected each one of them, understanding that now he had to prove with actions what his words tried to convey. He helped her with the garden, cooked for her occasionally, and always at the end of each day, thanked her for allowing him to be near her, even in a new light. One morning, as they walked together in a park, Sophie suddenly stopped and looked at him, her eyes shining with a new feeling. "I believe in second chances, Ethan," she said, smiling slightly. "But for me that means starting over. No grand promises." Ethan felt his heart fill with hope when he saw that she was willing to try. And so, under the blue sky of that day, they decided to start again. There were no certainties, just the trust that they were ready to face whatever came their way together. It wouldn't be easy, they both knew, but they also knew that they were willing to try. That simple act of walking side by side in silence was enough for Ethan. He understood that the peace he had been searching for was there, in the present, in every step, in every glance they shared. Ethan and Sophie began to cultivate something that resembled love, but was also made of forgiveness and friendship. The scar left by the past would never completely disappear, but now it served as a reminder that they were capable of overcoming even the toughest adversities. As the sun set on the horizon, they looked at each other with a new understanding. The cycle had finally closed. It was a new beginning, not with promises of perfection, but with the certainty that this time, they would be more honest and kind to each other and to themselves. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Sophie and Ethan, subscribe to our channel and activate notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel to continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. Until the next emotional chronicle.